turn it over to Becky and Co.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first panel of the Unscripted series, Sovereign Bodies, Sovereign Stages. We're so excited to have you with us this evening. My name is Joung. My pronouns are they, them. And I am a light-skinned mixed race person of white settler and East Asian descent. I have long, dark brown hair that's currently still a little bit wet from my shower. I'm wearing it down. It's parted in the middle. I have tattoos on my left shoulder, and I'm wearing a black tank top. I have facial piercings, and I am sitting on a gray velvet couch, and on the wall behind me is a whole bunch of art in little frames.
Awesome. Hi, and I'm Becky Gold. I am a white woman with freckles and green eyes. I have a brown grown out pixie cut. And tonight I'm wearing a black collared zip up jumpsuit with different colored roses all over it. I'm sitting in my living room in Toronto. And so behind me is a TV, some art on the wall, the lamp, and you can see part of my couch as well. Ku and I are the co-curators of Unscripted, Cultivating Languages of Access and Storytelling.
When imagining what this series could be, we imagined it as an opportunity to facilitate expansive conversations about accessibility in the arts. And to us, this means conversations about how we tell stories, who they reach, and the depths to which they can be understood.
We recognize that access is complicated and in a constant state of flux. It can evolve and devolve over time, shifting with our sociocultural landscape. Navigating and claiming access for oneself and one's community is in many ways a form of resistance.
With this in mind, we wanted to hear from artists who are intentionally cultivating methods of storytelling and performance that provide wider avenues of accessibility, whether sensory-based, linguistic, or cultural, for Black, Indigenous, queer, trans, deaf, mad, blind, and disabled communities.
We feel that the panelists and moderators included in this series exemplify what it means to take up space, to move, work, and tell stories in ways that are accessible and meaningful to them and the communities that they are a part of.
This panel series would not have been possible without the support of the series co-producers, Red Dress Productions and Theatre Passe Muraille, and funding from the Ontario Arts Council, Toronto Arts Council, and TD Bank Group.
Tonight, we are thrilled to have two interpreters, Carmelle, Cachero, and Rogue Benjamin. They are providing ASL interpretation for tonight's event. Rogue is a non-binary human with white skin, blackish brown hair, and green eyes. Their hair is pulled back in a bun, and they have a gray shirt on. The background behind them is half white and half navy blue. Rogue's video is currently off. Carmelle is a cisgender Filipina Canadian. She has long black hair and brown eyes. She is sitting in front of a solid black background, wearing a red sweater with a black t-shirt underneath with a light gray scarf.
We would now like to introduce tonight's moderator, Merlin Simard. Merlin Simard, pronouns yel, elle, she, they, is a disabled Franco-Ontarian trans-feminine performer, playwright, dramaturge, and filmmaker, originally from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and now based in Toronto. Select theater performance credits include Transactions with Buddies in Bad Times, BC Current, and NTS, Curious Voyage with Talk is Free Theater and DLT, Tape Escape with Outside the March, Fear of Men, a staged reading with Assembly Theater, and sorry, I'm just reading from a Google Doc and there's an anonymous otter that is clicking around and hiding parts, as well as Gruesome Playground Injuries with Playground Productions. Credits in TV and film include Grand Army on Netflix, This Life on CBC. Credits in playwriting include Fear of Men, in development at Theatre Passe Muraille, Zaddy Issues, which is in development at Ergo Arts Theatre, and Transactions, co-written with Gabe Maharjan and in development at Big T. Merlin currently holds the position of dramaturgy intern at Theatre Passe Muraille. Welcome, Merlin.
Thanks, Ku. Hi, bonjour. My name is Merlin Simard. My pronouns are she, they, il, ou elle, and I'm the moderator for today's panel. I am a white trans feminine settler of Quebecois and Scottish ancestry who's presently sitting on the ancestral land of the Wabanaki people in what is called Southern Quebec by us settlers. I have a round face. I'm wearing green eyeshadow. I have short brown hair. I'm also white. I'm wearing a green shirt with a golden chain. In the back, it's a white background. There's the edge of a picture with a canyon popping from the top of the screen. And I am also very happy to be here. An Indigenous member of my trans community told me recently that being Indigenous is sifting through the ruins of our house while a new house is being built on top. As we navigate a slew of pre-recorded land acknowledgements that passively honor the stolen land we stand on while directly profiting from that same ongoing theft, I think it's important that we look inward and understand our individual relationship with that same land. The system of white supremacy and colonization benefit from a lack of self-awareness. We need to ask ourselves as settlers, how have we embodied colonization? To confront how I uphold the violent theft of the land beyond just the room I currently am in. To acknowledge the rent that I pay to my settler landlord every first of the month. To acknowledge the water that flows through my apartment's pipe, the garbage that I make that ends up in landfill that I never saw. The place that I currently am that I call my mom's house, my parents' house, a place that was never theirs to call theirs. We need to acknowledge and dismantle from the bottom up the house that is being built on top of ruins that are still being sifted through. To understand that while our ancestors provided us with tools of destruction, we can actively give them up. We have to. So now I would love to introduce our two wonderful panelists. I'll start with Yolanda. So Yolanda Bonnell, she, they, is a queer two-spirit Anishinaabe and Ojibwe and South Asian DORA-nominated multidisciplinary performer, writer, and facilitator. Originally from Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Superior Robinson Treaty Territory, her arts practice is now based in Toronto. In 2016, Yolanda and Métis artist Cole Alvis began Manadoons Collective, and in February 2020, Yolanda's four-time DORA-nominated solo show, Bug, was remounted at Theatre Passe Muraille. Recently, she was also the Indigenous artist recipient of the Jayu Arts for Human Rights Award for her work. Yolanda proudly bases her practice in land-based creation, drawing on energy and inspiration from the earth and her ancestors. Thank you so much for being here, Yolanda. Hello.
Miigwech, Shani, hello. Thank you. Is it me now? Okay.
If you want to do an introduction.
Sure. Ani bojo Yolanda Nindishnikas Gishipa Manga Nindigo Jipamang Makwanindo Dem, Fort William First Nation in Donjaba, Dagarondo Ninda. Hello, welcome. My name is Yolanda Bonnell. My spirit name is Circling Wolf. And as Merlin said, I am from Superior Robinson Treaty Territory, Fort William First Nation, and myself and my arts practice are now based here in Dagarondo.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. So next we have Aria Evans, they, she, he. They are a queer Toronto-based West Coast-born award-winning interdisciplinary artist whose practice spans across dance, creation, performance, and film. As a public speaker, activist, and creative leader, Aria draws on their experience with Afro-Indigenous plus settler heritage. with a large-scale vision collaboration in the departure point to the choreographic work that Aria creates under the company political movement. Aria has collaborated across dance, theater, film, and opera with a number of the city's and country's most recognized companies and organizations. Advocating for inclusion and the representation of diversity, Aria uses their artistic practice to question the way we can coexist together. Hey, Aria, thanks for being here.
Well, Alan, miigwech, thank you. This is Aria speaking. And I'll just say I'm zooming in from Tagarando. I use all pronouns. I'm a 30-something mixed race, Afro-Indigenous and white settler, gender non-conforming human. My father's side is Mi'kmaq and Black African Canadian, and my mom's side is British. And I have medium to light brown skin, dark brown, wavyish long hair, and brown eyes. My hair is down and swept to one side. I am wearing one long black beaded earring, and I am in a long sleeve golden orange jumpsuit with a white undershirt. The background behind me is a white wall, and I'm sitting on a blush pink couch, and the sun is currently setting on my face, and you can see the shadow of the window behind me.
And this is Yolanda speaking. I just realized I didn't give a physical descriptor. If I could just do that now. I am a fat, brown-skinned, with long dark hair, which is in a braid to the side, and I am wearing black-framed round glasses. I have a round face, and I'm wearing heart earrings and a light blue sweatshirt that's off the shoulder. And my background is a tapestry of the moon tarot card with pillars and words that say the moon. And that is me, miigwech.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, Aria and Yolanda. I'm like very, very excited to spend the next hour and a bit with you. And it brought me a lot of joy today, thinking about this happening later today. Some first questions that I thought we could start with is, what should we consider sacred when we create? How do we best honor our own ceremonies? And I think this is like something that's within the context of these three panels around access is really important and difficult to do. I find that it took me a really long time to feel super confident in advocating for my access needs and to really make space for them in a way that isn't rooted in shame, in a way that isn't rooted in excuses. And I'm wondering if that connects with any of you within your own practice.
Yeah, I'll start. I think what I consider sacred when in creation, and anytime I'm holding space, is care. I think that when we talk about access needs, I try to think about care as a baseline. So care for the people that I'm inviting into the space that I might be creating with, or care for whoever's involved in that process or that project. And then most recently figuring out that I also need to extend that same care to myself. And I think that the more that we are open and honest about our access needs in any of these types of spaces or just in general, I think that it gives permission for other folks to feel that lessens that shame that you're talking about when we talk about making space for mental health or making space for physical needs. You know, anything that we might need to make ourselves more comfortable. I feel like the world makes us uncomfortable enough. Why can't we create in a space that is comfortable and safe? And so for me, yeah, I think when I think about the sacredness of creating, care is the thing that comes up for me the most, I think.
This is Aria speaking. Connected to that, I love, Yolanda, what you're talking about, care and extending that back onto yourself. I also think about bodies as being sacred and our beings and our spirits as being sacred. And if we put ourselves first, if we put ourselves before the work that we're making, that integrates into there being a sense of agency and also the care that gets reciprocated back to us through what we're making. And I also think that truth is something that I hold to be sacred. But I also think about in spaces where different people's truths might be somebody else's trigger, and how to hold space for that and how to incorporate care into holding many different realities to be important. And yeah, I think all of those things tie into what is sacred for me.
Totally. I think sometimes self-compassion is reflected within compassion towards community, and to really, to just really to hold things sacred, and to also understand that our truths are so personal and so delicate, and other people's truth are also delicate and unique, and to handle them with care too, about just thinking about community in that way, and just community with ourselves and our own limitations and what we think is sacred. And is there, within your own practice, like specific elements that feel very sacred to you? Or I guess when we're talking about advocating for something, what feels like when you're starting a project is something that you feel is important to advocate for?
This is Yolanda speaking. I feel like it depends on how I begin that project. If I'm beginning the project on my own, if it's something I'm creating by myself, it's important to me that I create a space that grounds me and connects me to those aspects, to those creative aspects of myself. I find that it's harder to, I mean, obviously it's difficult to create right now, but I find it's, instead of focusing on the harder, I think focusing on what does work. And for me, what does work is creating, that space with medicines, parts of the land around me. I hold all of those aspects of my creative practice quite sacred. I have to have, books around, or like notes that I write myself, things of that nature. But mostly it's just sort of, when I use my medicines, it's my way of inviting my ancestors into my work, and inviting us to have a conversation, inviting them into the space. I'm really intentional about that. And so that then makes the space itself sacred as well for me. When I'm working with other people, I think that for me, it's always about creating space and holding space. And so when I'm working with other people, it's giving them the autonomy to create the space as well, to be a part of that creation. Whatever you need, what can I do to provide that for you, so that we're all in a mindset where we can create together or work together in that sort of way. And so I think it's combining everything that makes it sacred for other people as well, and having that connection. That's my end of thought.
And this is Aria speaking, and a lot of what you've said, Yolanda, integrates into how I work and cultivate and hold space as well. I think the most about wanting to think about a creative process as being lateral leadership. And even inside of collaboration, there is one person who's potentially coming and guiding a process forward, but I desire that everyone that I've invited into a space with me feels like they can contribute ideas, feels like they can ask for what they need, feels like they can redirect the project it's going in a direction that maybe they're in conflict with, or they can just see another avenue, that what's sacred for me is knowing that we all have a voice inside of the work, and that the work is being made for our voices to come together. And yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons that I think Yolanda and I love working together, is because we have similar values when it comes to how we hold space. And I think about the responsibility of that as somebody who chooses to bring people together, and then as somebody who's also walking into a space with that ideology, and the different kinds of responsibilities that it comes if you're walking into someone else's space, wanting to bring these things with you and having to engage in hard conversations to try to open people's perspective to new ways of working with you that then gets returned. So, end of thought.
Yolanda speaking. Yeah, and I think that what's so great about the work that I think both Aria and I get to do is that we are in a unique and wonderful position as, you know, producing bodies to create that space for people. Often as artists, we are, you know, we are imbued to an institution, and the institutions are the ones that make the decisions. And so, you know, we can, I think, I always try to say, you know, we have more power than they let us think they do, or they let us think we do. We have more power. And I think that that is important, but often as artists, we get stuck in that sort of like the space that they create, and we don't have autonomy over that. And so what's great is that Aria and I get to create our spaces and hold the spaces. And why wouldn't we do it in that way, in the way that we want to see the world being built after we dismantle it, is is in this sort of vein of care and compassion, and making that accessibility space for anyone that we work with. Like, why wouldn't we do that? Because we can, you know. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. I'm really curious about how, if at any point there was self-discovery of that process within your own practices, or it was something that was always kind of like clear to you. End of question. Thought.
Aria speaking. I think for me, my desire to cultivate space in a way that builds agency comes from being in spaces that don't offer that. It comes from feeling like I couldn't speak up, that I was holding shame around my needs, that I felt like a tool for somebody else's vision. And I don't want to work that way. I don't want to live that way. I don't want to be in a world that is that way. So I think the conviction and the desire that I have to change the ways that we engage with one another are directly related to how I choose to work and who I choose to work with. End of thought.
Yeah, Yolanda speaking. Same, like very similar. Like I went to theater school. That's it. And you know, it's a traumatic experience in a lot of ways. And being sort of thrust into the industry, I saw the way in which this system worked, that it wasn't accessible. And that everyone just sort of accepted it, that it was like, oh, this is the way it is, so we must suffer. That is what an artist is. An artist suffers. And that just, look, I suffered enough in my life. You know what I'm saying? Like, I have been through enough. And, you know, I wanted to do this my whole life, and to step into, you know, professional storytelling, whatever that means. I used air quotes. You know, it just didn't make any sense to me. And I sort of saw that over time, that, you know, I tried to fit myself into that mold. I said, you know, if they can do it, so can I. But that's like, we all have different lived experiences that, you know, I had to confront my ableism. I had to confront my inner colonialism. I had to confront a lot of those things to really see that I deserved that same care, or I deserved care at period while I am working. And then and I think, you know, the second that I was able to create space, or that Cole and I were able to create space together, we, you know, it felt natural to create space for other people, to hold other people in this way. But it took me a while for it to come to myself, and then to realize how to hold that space. It definitely took some work. It took some unlearning, which I think is a normal part of this process. And yeah, and seeing how little care there was in these institutional spaces, for anything that you might be going through, that it was immediate as you come into the space, leaving your trauma at the door, which is like not possible for many of us. So yeah, it sort of came out of all those things. End of thought.
Yeah, Aria speaking, I just wanted to tap into that. Like Yolanda, you said you went to theater school. I did my Bachelor of Fine Arts in dance. And I think about what you're talking about inside of ableism and how to dismantle these expectations that you have for yourself. And being in the field of dance, like we have so many things to unpack when it comes to ableism, that like I think about the work that I'm doing and the things that I'm working on are just the beginning. Like I'm still in a work in progress stage, and I will continue to be in a work in progress stage, and there is no like final destination. And I think that that's like another thing to just know and name and to continue to consider, is this is something that we're going to be tackling forever. And again, like some of the things that we are doing might not be supporting a community, it might be in conflict with another community. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it's about investment, and it's about making the world a better place. So whatever that is and however that looks and whatever that becomes, it's about choosing that you're going to put energy into making that happen.
Yeah.
End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Yeah, I think like I really echo what you're saying about your experience with theater school. I think so much of colonial training institutions are really angled towards having young people embody a state of normal, which is really, you know, like what do we mean when we say normal? Yes, exactly. And to really like interrogate, okay, like does it mean having standing up straight? Well, you know, like that might not be a reality for someone. And to really understand that normal isn't this singular thing, but this really plural thing, if anything. So earlier, Yolanda, you touched about your ancestors' role in your process of art making. And I'm really, really curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that, Aria, too, if you feel you want us to share something. And if
yeah, Yolanda speaking. Yeah, that I didn't always work that way. Well, I think I have always worked that way. I think I just didn't recognize it. When I've been writing since I was like a child, but when I really started to intentionally bring my ancestors into work, I think that they sort of showed up in a way that I was like unprepared for. When I started doing my own sort of reclamation journey, you know, into my indigeneity. I mean, I grew up on a res, but reservation does not equal culture, and it took a lot of unlearning and relearning to find my way home, and part of that was opening my eyes and seeing who's been there with me the whole time. I'm gonna get emotional, oh my God. And so I went to work, I went to write a play in Newfoundland a few years ago. That the play was about, well, it wasn't about my family, but it was a love letter to my family. It was a love letter to the Indigenous women in my family. And it centered around the death of a matriarch in the family, and which was based around my grandmother's passing. Well, the summer that my grandmother spent in a coma, which then led to her passing a few years later. But so I was already sort of tapping into that because I was talking about women in my life that have lived. And Newfoundland, my grandfather was from Newfoundland, so I had blood ties to the land. But I wasn't expecting such overwhelming presence. And I guess for me, it's just, I have, when I wrote that play, I had pictures up of all the women in my family, and so I physically presenced them by image, and I sang for them, and I spent time out on the land with them, and I called them in, and they showed up, and we. It's hard to talk about it without it feeling otherworldly, and maybe it is, and maybe that's the point. But I physically feel them, and they physically show up, and I hear them, and we work together, and it's a strong, powerful, event to be able to communicate with our ancestors, and I think especially now in the world, I think they're very present. A lot of people I've been speaking to have been also feeling their presence, and I think that because we're in such a state of push and such a state of renewal and fight, that they're really presencing themselves right now, and which makes it, I mean, more palpable to tell stories with them, I guess. And yeah, so that's sort of how I started working with them, and now it's just a part of especially when I'm diving into new work, it's really important that they're there, part of that. Yeah, end of thought.
This is Aria speaking. I'm thinking about different artistic practices, and as somebody who doesn't necessarily write, who doesn't like invoke specific names or people into the stories that I'm telling, in connection to that, just maybe from like a little bit of a different perspective, I think that I feel my ancestors when I'm in motion, when I'm dancing, when I'm interacting with the land around me. I think about the times that I've visited like Nova Scotia and Mi'kma'ki, like where I've like had blood sacrifices be given to the land because it asked for that, and I like fell and cut my leg open, or when I've like found movements that feel ancient. There's something about like the blood memory and the physical bone sensation of hearing and witnessing and feeling those that are with me coming through me. And I don't have like a tangible way to articulate it other than I think through body, through movement, through dance, I speak and bring my ancestors to life. End of thought.
Yolanda speaking. Yeah, sorry. I just want to like, yeah, I think that's just it, right? Like they're, we hold them in our bodies, and we hold them in our voices, and in our inflections, and our thoughts, and our hearts, and our blood. Like it just I think is just I think it's just naturally, intrinsically a part of creation in any state, because it's in our body so much, and that it's, I've sometimes, like when my nails are long, I look at my hands and I'm like, oh, those are my grandma's hands, like and it's something as simple as that can be that sort of like connector between the two. And I have to say that like my friend Kim Senkla Parvi, she's a Coast Salish playwright. She said to us one time in rehearsal that she's like, "You're alive because your ancestor ran from a bear," and it was just like one of those things where I was like, "Oh yeah, that's true. That's probably very true. Somebody ran from a bear one day, or moved and started a migration. Like it's wild how present they are in ourselves and the thought."
And this is Aria speaking. I think what's interesting, like, as somebody who navigates like holding many ancestral lines in my body, I often think about like who do I want to let out through me, and how do they interact with the other ancestors that I hold. I think a lot about, like, Yolanda, you were talking about this time and this resurrection, and thinking about my like Black slave ancestors who have fought for their life over and over again, in relationship to how my Indigenous ancestors have done a very similar thing. And then if that energy to push forward is within me, how then do my like white colonial ancestors fit into that? And this ties me back to this idea of allyship, and how are we allies to all of the parts of ourselves, and how do we reconcile all of the pasts as we step into the future? And again, I think about like this good intention of cultivating space and creating opportunities. Like for me, repairing some of my ancestors' atrocities is part of what I want to be considered sacred in the future. End of
Merlin.
thought.
Merlin speaking. Like, yeah, I think that definitely it's interesting too to understand our ancestors as coming in our lives, not only in the context of artistic creation, but around community building and around relationship to community, and understanding, like, when I think of all of the trans women that came before me, really connecting with what I need right now, what they needed, 25 years, 50 years, 10,000s of years ago, and 10,000 years in the future, and how that's also really a connection to community in such a way that is really important, to understand that our ancestors move with us and follow us around. And yeah, I think that it's just really beautiful to hear you both talk about it.
Yolanda speaking. I think that it's important, that to recognize that ancestors don't always mean blood ancestors, that ancestors mean community ancestors too, because those ancestors also stand with you and also show up and presence themselves, because displacement is real and removal is real. And so the connection that we have with our communities and our communal ancestors are equally as important as our blood ancestors. End of thought.
Thanks for that, Yolanda. You also mentioned something else, Yolanda, earlier, about institutions, and how were they, I guess, accountable in making creation spaces that not only honor our ancestors, because sometimes I feel like it's really like there's definitely a disconnection with the spiritual, with that connection with our ancestors in most colonial practices. Like I feel like this is something that when I've spoken about my connection, it's been really looked down upon. And I'm curious into like how are they accountable in making these spaces, okay, honor our ancestors, but also safe and also really nurturing and catering to the sacred.
Yolanda speaking. How are they accountable? I mean, I think that there are institutions that are trying to make that space, and that are giving artists, the space to bring in their non-negotiables and their spirituality and the things that we bring into these spaces. I'll say like TPM has been really great in that regard, in terms of like offering space and having and providing that, you know, that ability. But it's tricky because I think that the more people are talking about this way of working, the more they're starting to listen, is what I'm sort of noticing now. I think there's a level of fear that might be happening right now there, that they could lose their most interesting work because if they're not engaging with our types of work. And then there's also those who don't fear that at all and are just catering to their white patrons, their white audiences. So I mean, there's, you know, we're seeing it all kinds of levels of the way in which that engagement is happening. I don't know if, I mean, my hope is that we keep pushing this forward and that more people feel safe enough to say, this is how I'm going to engage with work in your space, and this is how I need to feel supported. And that more institutions are like, yes, we will do that for you. But not every institution is going to do that, because at the core of why they're running is still capitalism, and they're not putting the story first. And so until institutions can actually put the story first, then we're not going to actually see that switch, right? We're not going to see them being held accountable for not engaging in those practices. And it's not to say that they have to engage in every spiritual practice, but give the space to artists and listen to the ones that are coming in that are saying, we would like to run in this way. And that particularly when it comes to like indigenous ceremonies, like smudging and having medicine present, having elders present or healers present, that is absolutely a non-negotiable and should never ever be denied an indigenous artist. I mean, I think really in spiritual practices, cultural spiritual practices should be always allowed in spaces. But I've definitely been in institutions where, you know, smudging has been like no, you have to smudge outside, or you have to go in that room over there, or down the hall and around the corner. Like, it's so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I know the answer, but that's just what I've been noticing in my rambling that I just said. I had some thoughts.
This is Aria. A few things came up in what you shared, Yolanda, so I'm just going to jump off from there. And
Please.
I think about, like, how do we also inform artists that they can ask for things? And then how do we inform these institutions that they can make that happen inside of the structures that they might be working inside of? Like, I think a lot about how we get boxed into this idea of like, well, the system is this way, and like, this is how things run, and this, like, we can't break that protocol, and no, we have to follow these steps. And to me, that's not about relationship building. That's not human to human. That's like bureaucratic, hierarchical BS that we can just get rid of, because if we want to move forward, we have to center relationships, and we have to center these like personal connections and show investment in people on a like personal level that goes beyond just one interaction. I think it's hard because there's so many sides to that. How do we educate artists? Like, do we infiltrate the school systems that Yolanda and I both went through to let emerging artists know that they can ask for support, they can ask for their practices to exist in the spaces that they're entering? And then how do we also allow like institutions and organizations that are hosting artists that are asking for things that are like should be a human right, that they do have the resources for it, that they do have the time to make it happen. That that it is possible. That it really is just about like maybe one shift of your frame of mind to make it possible to just create more nurturing spaces. And again, Yolanda, like you talk about like organizations not wanting to lose their most interesting, engaging work. And again, like artists are what bring people into spaces, and like reciprocity has to exist, and definitely power has to be shared. But if we can, again, like when I talk about like the microcosm of put the artist first before the work, it's also like in an institutional setting, like put the artist that you're bringing into your institution before the institutional structures.
Yeah.
End of thought.
Yolanda speaking. Yeah, totally. That's it. And I think like that's a great Aria. Those are great questions. Like how do we pass on that knowledge to artists, young artists especially, and how do we calm institutions down and let them know like it's gonna be okay. I think the only way that I do a lot of like workshops and facilitations and things like that with high school students, and so I try I try to get in. I'm like, if you're gonna go to theater school, please expect this is what's gonna happen, and that's not the only way you have to engage with art. But I think for me, like the best way I can possibly, what I've learned or what I'm trying now is just by doing by example. And when I'm engaging with an institution, I'm like, okay, so now I'm like, this is my I'm not gonna sign the contract that you give me. What we're gonna do is we're gonna sit down, we're gonna have a conversation about what this living agreement is gonna look like. And then we discuss that. And so that will now include care and, baselining care over profit, making sure that they're like, are the spaces safe for people? Depending on how far the contract goes, if it's a production, then it's like, I'm going to negotiate that we have shorter work days, that we have shorter work weeks, that we don't have 2 show days. The things that burn artists and designers and creative teams out need to not happen anymore. And so the only way we're going to start to see that is if we have those engagements and we start bringing those things to the table. Otherwise, we're never going to know if it doesn't work or works or not, right? And so I think leading by some kind of example is the only way that institutions, if they see that it works, at least with one person or 2 people, then maybe they can like continue to keep that up and continue these types of engagements where they're open and listening. And that what Aria is saying, that the power is shared, that there is an understanding that the institution, there's always going to be that hierarchy of power. They are the one that is providing the platform. They are providing whatever it is that they're giving us. And so the idea is not, we can't change that, but what we can do is change how we engage with it. That the institution does not have to wield the power that they have, that they can relinquish it and share it amongst us, so that we're all holding equally that we're all partners in that work. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Thank you so much, both of you, for that. Those are really thoughtful analysis of institutions, but also class. I think this like idea of like living arrangement is really interesting, because art making isn't just hours in a studio. It's emotional work. It's sometimes staying really late, and sometimes eating in these institutions, and really understanding that the ecosystem of an arts institution specifically isn't just limited to the art created, but everything that surrounds it. A great thing that you also said, Aria, was about how to put the artist first and the institution within that framework. And I think within the context of disability, it's a really interesting topic to talk about, because really what often ends up happening is that disabled people are brought in at the last second, specifically for plays, and they're like, hey, here's a relaxed performance, like, how can you do this? You know, meanwhile, the script has already been built with several like violent light flashes, there's loud noises, and like, I think it's been really thinking about capitalism, but also thinking about money in relationship to time, and how really the formatting of like creation, workshop, production is going to lead to this like idea that it's like within production, then we can bring on people. But really, if we conceive of time as this stretchy thing that can be like long and short, like is you know, adaptive, and it's, I think, a reflection of access too.
Yolanda speaking. Yeah, I agree. I think that, and something I really want to start, I need to start implementing into my work is accessibility from creation point. I took a wonderful workshop with Alex Bulmer, who is a lovely blind artist, and it was called Blind Imaginings. And we learned a lot about, you know, how to create work that does not need audio description. Like, how can we create work that is just inherently accessible? And part of that, I learned some of that work too from Kim Harvey. You know, and I brought it into, I tried to bring it in with Bug when last year with when we invited folks into the space, that, you know, they were allowed to leave their phones on, they could leave the space if they needed to, they could and come back in whenever they needed to, that there was, you know, that they were given autonomy over themselves. Because this, I don't know where this idea came from, where people have to like hold like they are not allowed to leave the theater. If they leave the theater, they're not allowed back into the theater. Who came up with that? What is that? Can somebody explain why somebody can't go to the bathroom? Are we so precious about art that we can't, like, it makes no sense to me. And it's incredibly ableist and for so many reasons. And so accessibility is on my mind a lot, and I know that I need to do more work into implementing it in from creation point, and being aware of all of that when I'm creating a story, that it's not that it needs to be for everybody. Because if I'm going to continue to talk about systems that harm, and because they're not for everybody, then they don't work, then I also need to be a part of creating something that lives within that realm, that it needs to be accessible for everybody. Yeah, end of thought.
Merlin speaking. Yeah, I think it's really, like, from what you're saying, like, it's really interesting to just think about all of these rules, and where rules become access needs, where they become safety, but where also they become quite the opposite most often, right? And to really, I think, finding that balance between rules that, you know, are conducive to inclusion and rules that are not conducive to inclusion, so exclusion. Another question that I have for the both of you is, how do you implement decolonial ways in your own practices and or in your own accessibility consideration when creating? So really process-based, not looking for an answer that feels like a how-to for everyone, but really personal and connected to your artistic practice in conjunction with your ancestors and of thought.
Yolanda speaking. Yeah, I think I've already, everything I've really talked about today is really kind of how I implement that. And it's interesting because I think a lot about the word decolonize now, I feel, has taken on a different meaning, and it doesn't, I don't necessarily know. Language changes all the time, and we're always trying to keep up with it. That's okay. And yeah, I do think of, like, when I think of decolonizing, I think of active unlearning, and active dismantling. And so I feel like decolonizing has to start with me, and it has to start with the work that I have to do on my brain and my body and my spirit and all the things that make me up. I have to do that work before I can, like, 100% in all honesty, give it over to somebody else, right? Like, I can give it, but it also still it has to start with me. I wouldn't have been able to do that work if I didn't start that process already, right? Of the unlearning of myself and what's been told to me my whole life. And so for me, when I think about decolonization, I actually think of it as decolonizing my own brain and the active work of unlearning these things that have been implemented my entire life growing up in this world that wasn't built for me, and making me feel like I had to find a way to fit into it rather than working against that and building my own world. And so when I think about how I hold space, I actually think about that as indigenizing as opposed to decolonizing. I think about, I bring in what feels to me like deeply indigenous practice into spaces. And so, which inherently is decolonial because it is they're old practices, you know, that we've never worked this way. And so, yeah, I think they're separate things with the same sort of, like, as a connector between the two, because I'm not going to go into a space, I'm not going to indigenize an institution, right? Like, I can't do that. That's not my job. And I don't want to do that. And I'm not going to decolonize the institution because, again, that's not my job, right? But what I can do is offer a space that is, for me, rooted in a deeply indigenous practice that is inherently decolonial. And then the decolonizing, I think, is something that it's personal. I think that we have to do that work, and that institutions in themselves have to decolonize themselves. They have to do that work. I can help by showing them how things are, that there are alternative ways of doing things. But I can't do that work for somebody, right? Like, that's sort of how I think, or you know, how I engage with that word. And it's constantly changing and shifting over time, because as language does, and as these processes do, the more we learn, the more we unlearn, the more it shifts everything, right? And but yeah, that's where I think I'm at with it right now. End of thought.
Aria speaking. The things that I think the most about when the word decolonizing or the idea of re-indigenizing comes up is how we spend our time and what we place value on. Like, I really think about unlearning the pressures that we put on creative process and being product driven and feeling like we have to, like, produce at a really fast pace that is all about giving something to be consumed. And I think about, like, different approaches to time, even inside of a rehearsal process. Like, Yolanda, I know, does this in their rehearsals as well, where you check in and you check out, and that's time that gets taken away from the work, but it's not actually taking away from the work, it's adding to the work. And just, like, shifting our perspective on what we place as being, like, valuable and not valuable. So time is one thing, and then also I think value, which we've talked a lot about, like valuing the people that are in the room, valuing what you're hearing them say that they need, valuing the fact that we don't need to burn out, that we can actually, like, care for ourselves, and that as a result makes our work deeper, makes our work like thrive in a way that, like, I think about if we can make work from the values that we believe in, like how beautiful of an offer could that be? So if we can place that into the way that we're working in rooms, that feels like decolonizing, and that feels like the change that I want to be a part of.
Mm.
End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Yeah, I think when we're really thinking about unlearning, like, I think like the way that I frame it within my own practice is thinking about imagination and feeling like unlearning requires that imagination. It requires thinking of something else besides what is colonially prescribed, you know, and to really, and I feel like imagination can be used to like really, how can we create a process that serves like your practice and isn't like a one size fits all for, you know, everyone like across the arts. Like that's not how it should work, or how it fits around disability, right? It's like, yeah, like even when thinking of access needs, like they're gonna change and they're gonna mean something different to someone else. Like I think part of unlearning is also unlearning that everything is the same, and that there's really this like, and to really get out of the binary, you know, but to fall into this like beautiful gradient of colors where things like shift and things also evolve outside of the gradient, and to really think about things like that too. One more question. I'm curious to, so this question is really interesting to me. Not that the other ones weren't, but around around body sovereignty and around specifically, and I think that really kind of endemic to both my experience with transness and my experience with disability, is that it took a long time for me to understand that I was the best person to know what was best for my body. And to me, that really fell into this like this area of body sovereignty. And as artists who have ties to indigeneity, I'm curious to hear how you feel that body sovereignty and land sovereignty intersect. Where do they meet? End of thought. And I know it's a big one, so you can think about that one for as long as you end of thought can.
Yolanda speaking. Okay, so this is something that's like, this is really big in my work right now, is I'm really trying to get people to shift our collective thinking about how we relate to the land and how our bodies relate to land. We come from the land, and so I think that there's, I mean, no, I don't think there has been a physical extraction of us from land, and we've put ourselves as humans in this hierarchy, right? Like we see ourselves as the top of the food chain, whereas like when I think about how we've, you know, at least for Anishinaabe people, traditionally thinking about it in a circle and a cycle, and that we were a part of the land, and so that it you know, whatever we take from, we keep moving so that we don't take more than we need. Like there's always been this like, there was always this sort of work in tandem with the land because we understood that we were a part of it. That we're no different from it, that's the same breathing. I breathe like the plants breathe. I have water like the water, like we all share those things with the land. Mm-hmm. And so, and we can see, like, it's not even, what drives me insane is when people call this, or sort of see this sort of idea as being mythical or spiritual or like something other than physical, when it's actually physical, it's tangible, we can see it, right? Like we are a part of the land, and there's a direct link to land extraction and to our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit folks. Like there is a direct link to that. We can see there is a map that was released. That was there was one on the above that showed the pipeline route, and then right below it they showed the sex trafficking route, and it's the same route. So like land extraction, body extraction, the same thing. And it's physical, it's tangible, it's real, it's right there in front of us. We can see it, right? And so I think that the more that we remember that we are a part of the earth, that we are a part of the land, the more we can start to repair that sort of relationship. The land is sick and we are sick. They're the same, right? As long as the land is sick, so are we. And I think that the more that we start to remember that, and the more we start to reclaim that work and really come back to the land and return to it, that healing can start happening, or that healing can move forward. Because the more we keep ourselves removed from it, the more sickness is going to happen, I think. And sickness means so many things, right? It can mean all kinds of things. And yeah, so that's how I feel about the connection between those two. And like, I think I think that, you know, as colonized people, there's been a feeling that like, because of that extraction and that extinguishment that happened, like that feeling of our bodies not belonging to ourselves, you know, and under the Indian Act, we're still the Queen's Indians, you know, like we're still belong to Canada. Our bodies are not sovereign because we are not sovereign people, and neither is the land. And so that's how those two are that's another way those two intersect, right? Like, until we are granted land sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty, those things we're not going to be free from that. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of like land back. Yeah, end of thought.
Aria speaking. I'm like, do I even need to say anything? That was like, I feel all the same ways. I think something that I can add is a proposal of a way of looking at it as a metaphor. Like, if you think about your relationship to the land, like, and you think about your relationship to yourself, where do those two things intersect? Like, if you love yourself, do you love the land in the same way? If you say that you love the land, how in return are you loving yourself? Like what Yolanda is saying about, like, our bodies are born from the land. We are made of the stardust. We have eaten the food that has fed us. We are drinking the water that makes up most of our body mass. We breathe the oxygen that exists in the trees that potentially we've planted. That the relationship between body and land is forever intertwined. And the idea of like the different Indigenous worldviews of like humans, we place ourselves at the top, but the land doesn't necessarily need us to survive. Like, we contribute to the land. We are a part of its evolution. And right now we're not doing a very good job of taking care of it. But I mean, like, historically, the role of the human does integrate into caring for the land and like allowing for species to continue and like plants to grow. But yeah, I think about the disconnected link between, like, if we loved the land the way that we loved ourselves, would it look the way that it looks right now? Or, I mean, it's also sometimes like self-love can be hard. So it's like, if you looked at the land like a lover and you consider how you're treating that lover, would you want somebody to treat you in that way? I think I'll take it back to a metaphor and then also drop the land back as my
Merlin speaking. Yeah, I think like especially the idea of a lover like brings in ideas of consent too, right? Of when is no, what is no, what is yes, when is yes. But also to understand consent as this, you know, not as this fixed thing, but as this thing that really is slow and like takes its time and is infinite. Consent is infinite. As my last question before we fall into Q&A period, I'm wondering, as we're talking about like land, because of the pandemic, like so much of our work is connected to technology, and I'm assuming that some of your work in the last year has been involved on a platform just like this, and I'm wondering how you maintain your connection to land within something that, well, technology is connected to land in some ways, but in many ways it isn't.
Yolanda speaking. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. I mean, our laptop. A lot of the technology that we have is from land extraction, and at the expense of labor that is probably not great. And so I think the more, especially this last year, I mean, we've been really reliant on these technologies. And so, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that. I've heard some acknowledgements being given about that in some places, in some virtual spaces I've been in, which I think is great, because I don't think people think about that, about where our devices come from and the uses that we have, and our dependability on land extraction and oil, and you know, these addictions that we have in the society. Yeah, it's a tricky thing to navigate, I think, because we wouldn't be able to have these connections if it weren't for those things. And so how do we hold those truths at the same time, right? It's always a hard one. And yeah, I mean, like, I've had to do workshops online for some of my work, and my work is so land-based. So it's been tricky to feel that connection. But I one of the first things I said when this pantomime first hit was that you know, that we have to remember that the land is still underneath us. Like, as much as we get stuck in our, you know, when we're stuck inside of our homes and having to communicate this way, that to remember that we are being literally held up by the land, and underneath our floorboards and our tiles and ceilings of people who live below us, and underneath their floors, that the earth is still there. And that, you know, if you go outside and you see like a little piece of greenery growing through concrete, or a tree on your walk, or any way that you can feel grounded or find that connection to the earth while having to go through what we're going through, it's important. And one of the things I noticed when everything happened last year was how many people started turning to the land, was how many people were like, oh, I didn't realize that I lived near this park, or, oh, I didn't realize how much I needed this tree. And I'm like, she's been there for you the whole time, baby. Like, she's been there for you the whole time, you know? And I want people to remember that, you know, and remember that the houses that we live on are on her, and that she's still holding us, and that she still exists underneath us right now. End of.
This is Aria speaking. I have two thoughts. One is like, how do we imagine our bodies as landscapes? And back to this idea of like land and body sovereignty, how can we also like recognize that land is always with us because it exists inside of our body? And I also think about how much the land has healed in this time where humans have been putting energy elsewhere, and what that means, and how we can learn from that, and how we can change our ways moving forward. And like, this last year has shown us a lot, but I think it's also allowed us to see the impact that we have on the environment in a way that a lot of us have always known and spoken about, but we haven't collectively like experienced it or seen the sort of like vast jumps back to like cleaner air, to like ecosystems thriving again, that our human footprint, like, we don't what can we live without? What are things that are in excess that we don't actually need? And that ties back to like capitalism and colonialism. But yeah, those are the two things that I'm thinking about. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, you're right, Yolanda. Like I meant to do a technology acknowledgement before. I'm a nervous girl. I forgot about it. But yeah, here it is now. Like we acknowledge that that technology like has an environmental like effect over resource extraction, but over producing it and thinking about the electricity that is required for our conversation today, and how and I think land is so inconspicuous around us, especially like people who live in city. I live in a city most of the time, but that tree will always be there. Hey girl. So now we'll be moving into the spirit of Q&A, where literally everyone who's on the Zoom call is invited to share some questions. I know in the chat there has been some questions already, so we can turn to them. There's two ways that you can ask your questions. So number one, in the chat. Number two is, so at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be like a little smiley face that says reaction. And within that reaction feature, you can wave your hand and you can ask your question from your little box. Yeah. So I think maybe we can start with the question that Lily asked. They asked, for Yolanda, how do you balance that offering of sitting down with institutions to coach them in that way and your free labor as a consultant?
Well, it's not free labor because I usually ask for a fee. The one negotiation that I didn't actually because I didn't think about it. But once we started negotiating, the institution was straight up like, and we're gonna add like $300 to your fee because you did all this labor. And I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. It's sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it's like, I don't think about it, right? Because it's just an instinct for me now. And I just want to like, make sure that I'm engaging in a good way. And then I often think about it afterwards, and then I'm like, oh, maybe I should have, But I mean, now I know, and I think moving forward, I'm gonna start making that a part of the conversation, because I think it is important that we, as artists who do this extra labor, do get paid for it, and that's incredibly important. That we are. That we know what we're worth, and that we are not afraid to ask for what we're worth, and that our time and energy just needs to get paid for, and that emotional labor is, particularly if you're dealing with like trauma enforced work, that there's there needs to be a cost to cover that, because it takes its toll, and often the artists that are speaking about these things are marginalized, racialized artists, and need the funds. and so I think that it's always a tricky thing to balance those things, and it's hard to ask for, it's hard to know what we're worth and hard to ask for what we're worth, but it's an important thing to put into practice, and to hold. And so I just have to think about it now more, and make myself aware of my own worth, and making sure that I'm presencing that when I'm engaging with institutions. End of thought.
Merlin speaking, and Aria, if you feel like there's something you want to add on this, even though the question said for Yolanda, I think like you're so welcome to share any insight you may have, if you feel like it.
Yeah, Aria speaking. I will just say one thing. Like I even struggle with this, where I don't know how much to ask to be paid for something. And I think about like how do we build a sense of transparency and a sense of support inside of our communities to like share the fees that we ask for when doing that kind of work, because there's so much gatekeeping when it comes to talking about financial compensation. So that's something that I'm thinking about. Kind of thought.
Yolanda speaking. Yeah, I think fee transparency is really important. As we've kind of over time learned, the paid discrepancies amongst artists, and one of the things that like Managers, for instance, is implementing is that we're trying to be open with everyone, what we're paying everybody across the board, so that people understand, everybody knows, and actors are invited to production meetings, like those types of things that somebody said in the chat, transparency, it is the ultimate, we need it when we have these engagements, because why are you hiding things? Why are we, and that it is important that we know what each other is getting paid, so that we feel like we're not being cheated or left out of those, negotiations in some way. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Yeah, it's interesting that the transparency idea and around trust too, right? So how, like, I think it's different from an organization to an artist, but it's like, because artists have really been like messed over by organizations and are still being messed over right now, especially in this pandemic, like to be like, where is transparency end and trust begin? And yeah, and I was just thinking too around like ideas of like, when is it, like I'm really kind of curious about your process of trust when working with a company, and this is a really vague question, but like, how do you trust? How do you create that trusting relationship where mistakes can happen, but also listening can happen more than talking? End of thought.
Yeah, Aria speaking. For me, trust gets built in many ways. I think one is showing humility and showing vulnerability, like admitting if you don't know something, recognizing if you've made a mistake. And if you are in an artistic leadership position, how do you model that same behavior so that other people feel like they can give back in that same way? And I think back to this idea of like time and value, and to again cultivate opportunities for these conversations to happen, that we are giving time and we are putting value on people's needs, that trust gets built. I think also, I think about this a lot when we like see ourselves represented in the places that we're working, that like trust also gets built by organizations showing you that you're not the only person of a certain community or experience or identity that they're bringing to work with them.
Yeah.
And like where we see representation inside of like organizational structure is like another way to build trust. Yeah, Yolanda, I know you were like about to speak, so I will jump off of what you were gonna say if you want to speak in the thought.
Oh no, yeah, Yolanda speaking. No, I think representation is really important. I think that community engagement is also another aspect of it. There are institutions that I literally have zero trust in at all. Like I don't, like, you've never been interested in these stories, and the stories that you've put on stage have been harmful. So like, you've got a lot of work to do. Then there are other institutions that are like, okay, what do we do? What do we help? And so there's, and that also takes that like the ones that are sort of stepping into it and being like, okay, like now what do we do? That's going to take some time, right? That's going to take some building of trust. And so I think listening, I think community engagement and not making it tokenism, that it's genuine engagement with community. Because if as an institution, if you have never had a relationship with a specific community, then how are you expecting that community to show up in your place and watch your stories? Like, you can't only invite people over once in a, you know what I mean? Like, you have to have a relationship with that community. Otherwise it's false and it feels disingenuous. So I think relationship building, community building is a really important part of that. I also think just the understanding on both parties, or all parties involved, that harm will happen. It's not usually a matter of if, it's usually a matter of when it's going to happen. And it's a matter of how that harm gets handled. And like, how are we discussing it? And so when I was in negotiation with this, these agreements, that was a part of it, is like, when harm happens, or if and when harm happens, this is how we're going to handle it. And I think an acknowledgement of that is important, because if we need to understand that, like, not everybody has all the answers, and that we're all trying to figure it out together. But listening to artists is important. And that there's the chances of something happening, that harm happening within an institution is high. And so it's a matter of how it's dealt with, and how it's dealt with is incredibly important to how the structure of trust gets built. And if we see that being dealt with in a way that is causing further harm, then that trust gets broken. Whereas if we're, adhering to this agreement that we had, or these oral agreements that we have, or these discussions that we're having, that is an important aspect of it as well. But acknowledging that it's going to happen is I think a big part of it, because we're trying to build something new, right? And within that, there's always going to be questions and uncertainty. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Thank you for that. It's very, I think, trust is a really complex thing to talk about, but also feels really simple. And on some level, just like, yeah, relationship, community, and really owning when you mess up. Thank you so much, Yolanda and Aria, for those thoughts. So, okay, someone raised their hand, but just before we had a question about, I'm curious about how, as a two-spirit person, how can I indigenize my own creative process and recognize and include my ancestors into my work? End of thought.
Yolanda speaking. I mean, I think that's I think it's personal, right? Like, I think it's what you feel works for you and your body and your spirits and your practice. For like, what works for me might not work for you, and what works for Aria might not work for me, and so, like, it's I think that taking the time to listen to yourself, and taking the time to just sit. And I find that being on the land is helpful, because being on land quiets everything down, and it allows me to open and really listen. And I think that's where a lot of those answers are found, is in those sort of like those moments of reflection, or doing the things that bring you joy. Where are you most comfortable? How are you most comfortable? I use medicines to call my ancestors in, and I find physical presences sometimes of them. I keep rocks around me all the time. Those are some ways in which I keep the land with me, and sort of keep them, everything sort of alive and active. But I really think it's about, tuning into yourself and asking yourself what you need. What do you need when you create? What works for you? And going through those series of questions, maybe as if it's somebody else, you know. I think that self-love is hard, and sometimes it helps to think about, you know, yourself as like the person you love the most in the world, and seeing your way through that. I wish I had an answer for you. I feel like it's so personal to you, and that I think that if you really spend some time listening to yourself and lighting that smudge and sitting with the medicine, sitting on the land, that you will find the deeply rooted Indigenous practice that lives within your body, because it's there. Yeah, end of thought.
And Aria speaking, I would offer, ask yourself, what does indigenizing mean to you? And to articulate it for yourself, to then be able to implement it in a way that feels authentic for you. And then to ask, like, how do you want your ancestors to engage with your work? What ways are you hoping that they are present and that you want them to hold you? And go from there. If you can clearly articulate your wants and your needs, you can like call them back into yourself. But you have to know what those two things are and what you want from those two things before you can start to integrating that into a creative process. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Okay, so we had a raised hand, Chantal Gagnon. Please, I don't know where you are.
I'm right here. Tansei. Hello. Okay. I'm actually in Treaty 7 territory in Mulkinstis, which is in Calgary. But hi, Yolanda.
Hi, Chantal.
I had the pleasure of working with Yolanda when she was here in Mulkinstis doing Bug, and that was such an amazing experience. And she brought back a song that I thought was gone from my life, and I was just so humbled for that. So, hi, now I'm going to get all teary. Okay. But I'm just going to describe my background. So I have a beautiful red wall. To the left of me, I have a red and black drum bag with beautiful Haida art on it. To the right of me, I have my traditional hand drum with a couple of, they're t-shirts wrapped around foam to soundproof my room a little bit. And all of my traditional medicines are laid out to the side of me, as that's part of my practice. I am Anishinaabe, Métis, and Cree from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, which is in Treaty 6 territory. But my question for you, so I'm in the West, which we are leaps and bounds behind you, unfortunately, when it comes to inclusionary practices, insofar as even physically inclusionary practices. So I've gone through many surgeries where I was in a wheelchair for 6 months at a time, and there was a lot of spaces that I could not enter as an artist, which is just, it's heartbreaking. But beyond that, one of the challenges I think, not only here in Mulkinstis, but pretty much everywhere across the globe, is lateral violence. So how do you navigate the lateral violence that we're experiencing on a regular basis when we're trying to build relationships with different organizations and different community organizations, when that lateral violence can be so insidious to actually break down those relationships that we've been building? There's been a few organizations that I worked really hard to build a relationship with. I was with that organization helping with events for 5 years, and then I wanted to give another artist an opportunity to bring her crew in and perform and present, and she took that opportunity to basically slander me and ruin my relationship with that organization. And so unfortunately, it's really, really difficult to navigate that. And, you try and do it like humbly, and I've always been really kind, and I always, everything I do is inspired by the 7 teachings and making sure that I leave a good, world for my 7 generations. I'm a mom. I'm a single mom with 4 kids. Well, when Yolanda, I only had 2 kids, but I took on 2 kinship care kids right before the pandemic, so we got to know each other real well. So now I'm a mother of 4, but I want to maintain that leadership role within our communities. So how do we address it in a good way, and how do we make sure that that lateral violence practice can, you know, be navigated and hopefully subdued?
Yolanda speaking. Miigwech Chantal, it's so good to see your face and hear your voice. Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is that it's important to recognize that, you know, Indigenous folks are not a monolith, and that we all feel and think different things and have different opinions, and not everybody works the same way. You know, I think that we all, and that is sometimes what can cause that lateral violence that Chantal is speaking about. You know, is that we all operate differently, and not everybody, you know, holds the same worldviews, and that's okay. One of the the best things I ever heard was, all of this is true at once, you know, and I think that is true. Somebody else's truths are as true as my own truths are, and so and that paradoxes and conflictions will always exist with each other. And so, yeah, lateral violence is a tricky thing, especially in our industry, and especially in amongst Indigenous people. It's always a hard one. It always stings different, you know, when it's your own community hurting you. I think that for me, I try to hold the deep understanding that colonialism runs so deep, and that our brains are so colonized in so many ways. And so for me, I don't think of that as an excuse. I think of that as a truth, right? Like, that is a truth that we are all holding, and some people are at different points with it. And so for those folks that are causing that harm and causing that violence, it's coming from a colonial space. And I just then, you know, I just feel bad that they're not at the point where they've done that work yet. And I hear you when you're saying, you know, as a leader, it's hard to engage with that, because it's, you know, you never know, well, you don't know when it's going to happen. And when it does happen, it's like, how do you hold people accountable, right? And yeah, I think that we've had some good examples of holding people accountable. I think we've had some bad examples of holding people accountable, because we are not perfect, and it's always going to be complicated when we're dealing with these things, these aspects. I don't know if I don't think I'm answering anything. I think remembering and understanding and holding their truth along with our truths, and I think that remembering that it's not about you, you know, it's not about, and when it happens to us, it's not about us, it's something that they're going through. It's a them problem, but they're making it about you. So that when they harm you and when they cause that lateral violence, they're making it about you, but it's really about them. And I think that when I remember those things, and when I hold those things, it makes that hurt a little bit less. And then, you know, it's hard to remain, I feel like it's hard to remain diplomatic in situations when I find, for me personally, there's like a lot of like fighting going on around me. And so then it's like, I have to hold my own truths steady in all of that. And so I think holding your truths, holding your values, staying strong in that core, remembering who you are and where you come from and the things that you do, is an important aspect of dealing through that and moving through that as well. Knowing that, you know, you did the best you could, and you did all that you could, coming from that core system of values inside. Yes, and what you said, hurt people, exactly. So yeah, I think I hope that helps. End of thought.
Aria speaking. I'll add a few things. It makes me think about the difference between calling out and calling in.
Yeah.
And how to center yourself and how to center your needs and your capacity inside of how you decide to engage with somebody who has hurt you. And it makes me think about like the three different kinds of people. It's like there's folks that as much energy as you pour into them, their minds are never going to change. They're never going to see things your way, that they're like immovable. And maybe that person isn't somebody that you want to invest your energy into trying to change their mind. And then there's people that are just uninformed, but are willing to learn and willing to grow, that are in the middle, that like don't necessarily stand on either side. And then there's the people that just need to be contacted to be able to like apologize or to acknowledge that hurt has happened. And it makes me think about like how to apologize and what we're seeking when we're asking somebody who has hurt us to engage with us inside of some kind of conflict resolution, and to really know what we're going into it seeking. Do you want them to just acknowledge that they did something and that will make it better? Or is there more that you're craving to be able to move forward? And if you can like look at the overarching structure of the scenario that happened, you might be able to engage with it in a way that's going to care for you the best, because you have to look after yourself first. End of thought.
Merlin speaking. Thank you so much, Aria and Yolanda. Just flagging that we have about 5 minutes left. So we might just take the last question in the chat, which is, I'm not Indigenous, but Asian Canadian, and on the margins and underrepresented. How does this situation look to you navigating the theater world? Is there any push for a coming out party yet?
Yolanda speaking. I'm unsure of the question. What, can you repeat it? Wait, I'm looking at it right now. Okay, so I think that I think if you're talking, if you mean like a coming out party in terms of like being of representation in the theater industry, I mean, I think we're getting there. I actually do think that I've been able to see a change, like track a change in terms of whose stories are being told, who's telling those stories, and who's on stage telling them. What I'm not seeing is leadership positions. There have been some. We've seen some of those changes, but I think there needs to be more leadership positions from people who look like us. Because it's the people who are making the decisions, right? It's the people who are making the financial decisions and the hiring decisions. Like, those are the people that we need. We need more, representation in those aspects. But I do think that, there's been a shift in storytelling in the industry. And it feels like a walk, like we're walking there, I don't know if we're I don't know if we're quite ready for a coming out party yet, because a lot of people made a lot of promises after last summer and then did not follow through with those promises. So there's been a lot of performative actions from institutions, and I'd just like to see more actual action before I give over to them and say, yeah, you did it. Like, I think that there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I asked the question. So.
Oh, sorry.
I asked the question because it's regarding I'm sort of on the edges, on the fringes. Like I volunteer for the Toronto Fringe, I volunteer for SummerWorks, and I see that people are coming from overseas, but they are more commonly overseas. You know what I'm saying? There's people from Germany, from France, from Italy. There, about 2 summers ago, there was a group from Hong Kong, but they live in East Coast Canada. I mean, but I don't see it happening in Toronto. I mean, if I'm applying for a job, and like, I'm on the fringes right now, so I'm not really applying it. I'm getting there. It's about not knowing where I can go with my statement of what I can do. You know what I'm saying? What can I do for me? What can I do for the company? What can I do for general people of Asian descent and for Indigenous people? And if we're going to leadership roles, which I'm not aiming for, but it includes these marginalized people, Blacks included and women and all that. So I mean, where are we exactly? Here I am, an Asian Canadian, asking you this question. Is there a coming out party needed? Like, can we just slide into this sort of situation? And yeah, I don't know if you have those answers. You probably don't. Never mind.
Yolanda speaking, or Aria, do you have something to say?
This is Aria speaking. I was just gonna say, like, especially because I exist in both the theater community and I also exist in the dance community. And I think about like how I've seen conversations get started, and more so in the theater community than in the dance community, which is why I like find myself desiring to be more involved in the theater community in Taekwondo specifically. But the conversations are starting, and we can see that there are statements of intention. And now is when we wait to see and we push for action. And I think about like, not like, how do we dismiss the idea of like organizations thinking that we're entitled to something when there's like a history behind why we should be given platforms inside of these institutions? And again, I'm not really answering your question, but I really do think it comes down to the accountability of these organizations who have said that they want to make a change for radical inclusion, and that it's now about making that happen. So folks need to get hired, people need to step down from their positions, money needs to get redistributed, that there's tangible ways that we've talked about this coming out party that we need to, now is the time that we start to see those things happen. And because we haven't seen it, I don't know what it looks like.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good to what I hear. So thank you.
Yolanda speaking. I do just want to add too, like that there are the institutions that are doing some really great work. Like I think about TPM and I think about Cahoots, and like these are institutions that have programs available as well, right? So if you look into there are different like creators units, or like newcomer experiences, or like there's a lot of these institutions do have these ways of being involved with them that can connect you to community, and then it's sort of that way into the industry in a way that's like not as traumatic often as some other ways can be. And so yeah, I would say, look into some of these different institutions that are on the forefront of diversity and inclusion, and they have a lot of programs that can be offered that can that are gateways into community connection and platform for storytelling.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Merlin speaking. I think we're just about out of time. I really want to thank you for holding this space, but also for your trust, your generosity, and just really being so eloquent and so amazing. And really, Miigwech, thank you. Merci. I'm really grateful for having spent the evening listening to both of you.
Miigwech.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for your generosity and engaging in such poignant and meaningful conversation tonight. Yolanda and Aria, it was such a pleasure to hear you both speak. And Merlin, thank you so much for moderating and having such evocative and wonderful questions. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I just echo Ku speaking. I echo everything that Becky said. Thank you all, Merlin, Yolanda, Aria. I'm really, really grateful to have been able to be here for this conversation. Thank you also to our interpreters, Carmelle and Rogue, as well as TPM and Red Dress Productions. And thank you also to the behind the scenes crew, Liz, who's been running this Zoom the whole time, as well as Caradwin, who's done a lot to help sort of set up the whole tech situation, Rinchen at TPM, who's supported a lot with panel coordination, and countless others at TPM. Becky?
Yeah, and big thanks to our audience for joining us tonight. Thanks to all those who offered some really wonderful questions. We really appreciate it. And just before we wrap up, I want to mention that we have another panel tomorrow evening called Rebuilding Sensory Worlds, and we hope that you will join us. You can still register for tomorrow's panel if you're interested.
And also just a reminder that there is a active listening breakout room that will remain open for the next 30 minutes. And so because of how Zoom works, we're not actually going to end this meeting because if we end it, the breakout room will end. So we invite you to leave on your own accord. We won't kick anyone out. And I think Liz has also posted a survey into the chat a little while ago. Maybe Liz can post it again. And I think it'll be sent out to everyone who registered via email. So if you have a couple minutes to fill out the survey, that'd be awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Miigwech. Pamapi. Have a good night.
Laliak, folks. Good night.